Good morning, everybody. We've got some folks, I think, waiting for us on the Facebook Live, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kristen Miller. I am the Executive Director of the Louisville Bar Association. Thank you guys all for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. We certainly appreciate the partnership we have with Volunteers of America, who brought this idea to us to do the Restorative Justice Forum, and we're very excited to have them here as our co-sponsor and have this great panel of speakers and our moderator. So, of course, we've got Libby Mills from Volunteers of America. We've got our County Attorney Mike O'Connell, Jefferson and Angela Bisig from the Kentucky Supreme Court, and our moderator Tom Williams from Stoll, Keenon, Ogden. And I'm going to let them take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks to Volunteers of America and the Louisville Bar Association for hosting today. I was telling several folks that this is really a full circle experience for me. I learned about restorative justice in 2007 when I was bar president, and we had our first community conversation about restorative justice here on that day in probably September of 2007. And one of the elected officials who sat there that day said that pigs will fly before this gets off the ground. So if you see pigs flying around, we're happy about that. And the other thing that it reminds me of is I recently, a few years ago, visited a homeless shelter in San Antonio, and it had this beautiful facility, and they were just on their 7th director in like 2 years. And I asked them about it, and they said, we were born a fully formed tree without roots. Because basically somebody put a lot of money into an issue without the groundwork. So the roots of restorative justice have been growing here since 2007. And we had basically the team who started talking about it early on. I like to credit Mike O'Connell. He heard a Leadership Louisville discussion about it, and Mike was the gatekeeper to the work here in our community. If Mike said no to this, his role, this county attorney, doesn't go forward. Judge Bisig, we were talking before that she's been a prosecutor, she's been a judge, she's been a judge of the year. She used to be our one who would write to Justice Minton every year saying that we should do more restorative justice, and now Judge Bisig is the one that we write to about doing more restorative justice. And then last but not least, Libby Mills. Libby spent her career as director in juvenile court in the state. She was our first executive director of Restorative Justice Louisville, and now she's with Volunteers of America. She was the feet on the ground, the one who's learned about this and really allowed it to grow. As an attorney, before we kick things off, I will say that when you go to law school, they don't talk to you about situations where you start crying. But what I found when I learned about restorative justice, the stories were so beautiful and healing that they would often bring tears to my eyes. And we didn't have metrics early on, but I always said that I don't need metrics to know that this is a better way to do things. Situations appropriate. So we've been very blessed. We've had a lot of community leaders who would stick with this work for so many years. I wanted to kick things off with Judge Bisig just to give a little bit of the early history of restorative justice and bringing things up to where Libby's taken over as chair of Restorative Justice Louisville.
Morning or good afternoon. Can you all hear me? All right. Good morning. There's only a couple other people I want to point out that are in this room. My name is Justice Angela Bisig. I've been a judge here in the community for 21 years and started on our Kentucky Supreme Court in January. I laughed with Tom and Libby and Mike that we were getting the band together today because we were kind of the original core group along with Judge Steve Rashawn, who did some groundwork in trying to introduce these concepts to our community. I do want to ask of you all sitting out there, I see some faces. Judge McKay Shaban has been a board member of the Volunteers of America. And I always tell him he was practicing restorative justice, even though he really wasn't aware of it. He used to do a program, kind of a circle with his probationers, where they would talk about the offenses that occurred. So I'm happy to see you here. He also does some felony mediation for our court system. Jennifer Hancock is in the very back. She is the new leader of this cause, and we could not be more grateful to have her. She is energetic, dynamic, has contacts around the state, and has really enabled us to scale up the use of restorative justice. And then next to her is John McCarthy. His company has helped us again to reach out to people in our legislature to be able to bring this work full circle. How many of you all sitting here, since it's a fairly small group, have had some kind of training on restorative justice, or think you already kind of have a good idea of what it is? All right, I didn't know how that's in bolts to get, but I wanted to know that before I start. So I wanted to say, Tom said I was a former prosecutor and judge. You know, I'm all about people being held accountable if they commit a crime. And I think it's important to know that restorative justice is a tool in our whole criminal justice toolbox. But I went back in 2008, talking about the early days, to Oaxaca, Mexico, to look at their rules of criminal procedure. They have a written process there, and landed myself. And when I moved into my Supreme Court office, I actually found my materials, landed just by pure chance in the middle of an international restorative justice conference. And I heard speakers from New Zealand and Rwanda and California and other places where they had existing programs. And literally, when I heard the information about restorative justice and what it could do as part of your justice system, my jaw hit the table. And it's crazy because, you know, you go to conferences and sometimes you take a little notes and stuff. I'm just overwhelmed by the number of notes I was taking because I was so grabbed by this information. But restorative justice is really based upon the theory that when someone commits a crime, they have an obligation to make it right. And it's victim-centered. That the pillars are, we want to focus on the victim and make sure whatever harm that came to them because of the events, that they feel like that harm is beginning to be repaired. It involves more of the participation of the community than we may have in that traditional crime and punishment paradigm. And it's allowing the person who caused the harm to be part of the fix. And that becomes an important part of the magic that happens with restorative justice, because when lights come on for them and they can be part of the solution, they're no longer othered and made a criminal and not be able to be brought back into a participating member of our community, being able to get a job, work and support their family. So those are the core principles of restorative justice. But when I think about it, a gentleman named Alan McCrae talked about how in the country of New Zealand, that has about 4.3 million people, and a disproportionately confined Maori people, who are a people of color, in their criminal justice system. Back in 1989, they adopted legislation implementing restorative justice in all of their juvenile court cases, save murder and manslaughter. And I was telling Tom, I just noticed because I got my materials, part of what they called the legislation was strengthening families. Legislation to strengthen families. When they put restorative justice, they implemented a family group conference into their juvenile offenders. They were able to reduce their crime rate by a full 2/3. They were able to reduce the number of days they held juvenile court. And their offense rate, their reoffense rate among offenders went from about a 75 to 80% down to a 10%. And that's when my jaw was hitting the ground. I wasn't even there to hear about restorative justice, but I thought, those are astounding statistics, really astounding. And so a group of us here, Mike, Libby, Tom really took the leadership role, put together back in 2010, basically a community board. We had the county attorneys represented, we had the police department represented, we had the Louisville Bar Association was our early partner. I don't know where Kristen went, but they allowed us to have space here to operate out of and help give us administrative support. We had members of faith group, and we all came to a table and we looked at this data, and we looked at the information, and we said, where could we fit this in our criminal justice system here in Louisville? And we started programs through the Bellas here in our juvenile court in 2011, where we started having individuals from Mike's office prosecuting juvenile cases, refer cases. And Libby became the executive director. I also got this in my time machine. We created Restorative Justice Louisville, which was a nonprofit that had Libby as our only paid person. And then one fine day, we actually fundraised enough to be able to have a case manager. We have all volunteer force that facilitates our family group conferences. And a family group conference takes the person who was harmed by the crime, the person who caused it, their support group, the police officer, if they're available and can be a part of the conference, a community member, if there's a community that's impacted by the crime, and a trained facilitator. And again, Libby plays the role of training all of our facilitators. And they sit down and they talk about what happened. And it allows that victim face to face to tell the offender what they did and how it impacted them. And maybe that they've been in counseling, or maybe that their children have had to go to counseling, or maybe that they're fearful of leaving their home and going to a mall parking lot because that's where they were accosted. It really allows them to say what happened. And then the offender goes back with his group and makes a list of things they're going to do to repair the harm. And they bring it back to the group, and then the group approves that list. And then the judge in the case becomes the arbiter. Are we going to do the things we agreed to do as part of the conference? And it sounds really simple. Tom used to say when we go and speak to groups that it really is so simple. How is it different? But we take surveys of our victims when they leave these family group conferences. And I can tell you, I'm a believer in our criminal justice system, imperfect as it is. But the rate of victims feeling satisfied leaving this type of process is almost at 100% rate. Because they get to say what happens. They get to see who their offender was and tell them the impact of that crime. So it's something that we're all very passionate about extending to both our community and our state. We have long wanted our state, and I just got back about 3 weeks ago from a National Restorative Justice Conference in Seattle, where I met with 28 other judges from around the country. And I can say there's only maybe 2 places that from what I heard was going on, that are further along than we are here, and we still have a long way to go. But I cannot thank each of you for taking a few minutes out of your afternoon to come and hear about this. You're all leaders. I see Amy Covage, our former bar president, sitting out there in faith with our Criminal Justice Commission. You're all leaders in our legal community. And the more we continue to get the word out of what this is and what we're trying to do and the goals behind it, the better that we'll be able to expand this work. So that's a start.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll next move to Mike O'Connell. Mike, as you all know, is passionate about our community and passionate about justice issues. And when we first discussed this, I was quite frankly really nervous that he would not embrace this, because it's quite frankly easy just to be quote unquote hard on crime and not look at the bigger picture. So Mike, just would like you to speak to obviously whatever you would like to speak to, but why you were willing to take a chance on restorative justice back when you were in the day. On topic.
Thank you all for being here. As Justice Bisig mentioned, we got together some years back now to discuss this idea, and these two here were the two that really set the ball in motion. And I got invited to come in and that type of thing. But I first heard restorative justice. I had made a Kentucky Bar Association convention years ago. One afternoon, they had one of the blocks of where you go. It's a restorative justice. I never heard of it before. I thought, well, I'll just go in here. I didn't like what was going on. And so these people in North Carolina were on that one. I mean, it's just so foreign at the time. And so it was the history of how it got going with back in 2009, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there was room, the community members that were on this committee, all walks of the communities, you know, religious, business, social, everything. Court system, folks. And they worked very hard and put this together, but, sitting here in 2023, it becomes to be increasingly difficult if you want to sit and talk to somebody about, oh, I'd like to talk to you about restorative justice. We've got this program where the victim and the perpetrator get together and come into a room and people, most people, they say, what the hell are you talking about? Fighters, peacemakers, writers, talk about the difference between restorative justice and then retributive justice, which is retribution. Another fancy word for retribution. So, when I heard that the role that the victim played in this, it caught my attention because if a victim says, I do not want to participate in this restorative, there is no process in taking it. But we kicked it off and still are kicking it off. Everybody, Scooter Bell is back there. His real name is Henry. He's known as Scooter ever since he was a child. And he's been the head of juvenile court for 18 years. I think Scooter, that person.
Been in juvenile court 18 years.
Yeah. And when I was in another life was a young assistant county attorney, we were all part-time in the day, and I got assigned to juvenile court at that time there. So it was, I had a relationship. And when you go to court, those of you in here that they're from the court system a lot of times, but especially in juvenile court, you go to court, case is called, the victim may have gotten subpoenaed for that day, or they got notified. So you go into a conference room, talk to the victim, you know, what do you want to do here, what happened, tell me about it, et cetera, et cetera. And then, okay, we go out, have a seat outside, and I'll get back to you in a minute. And you go over to the conference, private attorney, conference case with the defendant's attorney or the minor in this case. And so the victim's still sitting over there in the corner in the court. So then the judge said, okay, call a case with Johnny Jones, et cetera. And the case would come up and you gave the victim permission to sit in the courtroom with their confidential proceedings. And there's a victim in the back of the courtroom. And everybody's got their back turned to the victim. You can picture this. You know, you get the counsel under the table, you got this and this, and the victim back there, and everybody's got their back. So they're out of the real juice of the whole process. And if the judge says, Ms. Smith, do you have something you'd like to say? Contribute, you know, would you like to? They're nervous, they don't know, you know, back there. Oh, no, Your Honor, I'm fine, you know, whatever happens. And so this process gets the victim right in the room with the facilitator, obviously, the other side, and it's a sort of mystical process that takes place, but you know, people start to talk like that, and you can imagine the difference. There are many looking on many amazing stories about this, and it's a good thing. Again, if you try to sell it on the street out there today, you wouldn't have much luck. If you try to tell it to somebody about what is that, you know, they all already behind bars, they'll get smashed and get these people in line and do all that kind of stuff, and you know, and throw them in jail, lock them up, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some pretty good statistics that show that those, now we've been dealing a lot with 18 or others, that the rate of recidivism after going through that goes like that. Goes like that. They don't have that kind of experience. It does not go like that. So it worked. And, we see, a lot more serious offenses in juvenile court these days. I shared this story with, people before when I was a district judge. I'm been at juvenile court, I volunteered for juvenile court docket, those years, it was 2 years rotation of juvenile court, I might still be in that, but. And there was, the docket was divided geographically, not alphabetically, so there was East End docket, South End docket, West End. Well, I volunteered for the West End docket, which is Portland, West Louisville, parts of Shapley, and Stone Marion. During that 2-year period that I was serving on juvenile court, district court, I did not have one gun case. Not one. Now, that is extraordinary. Fast forward. It was interesting too, the kids in Portland always, they had their own thing, they respected the other kids in West Louisville, kids in West Louisville, they respected the Portland kids. And, they each had their own foibles about what they thought was cool back in the day. And so, but not one gun case. That's incredible compared to what's going on today. And somebody would say to me, don't get Mike started on gun. But it's a fact. It's a fact. And, but bringing people together in this situation, is this, I was for it because I thought, A, it's the right thing to do. B, let's try it. I mean, if it's the downside of trying it, people want to respect it, or a lot of it, let's do this. And all the three full people follow the committee. So I was behind it 100%. I'm going to pass out here. I didn't bring my copies, but I'm going to pass out here. I'm also on the board of what's called GBI, Group Violence Intervention, which was started by the John Day Institute in New York, brought down here, and it's very backed by that time Russell Coleman, who's the U.S. attorney here locally, and it's an amazing group, amazing organization, and but it's aimed at shootings a lot, guns, victims, what's going on, how do we reduce that? And there is a little police officer by the name of Ivan Hager. He goes by Hager, he goes by Ivan, he goes there. He is extraordinary. He's the LMPD officer assigned to GBI. He knows more about gun violence in this city than anybody with 2 feet walking around. Okay, every time we have a meeting, which he puts together stats, and what's interesting on these stats, I hope you all will share this with make it extra copy. What's interesting on those stats, he has fatal shooting, non-fatal shooting incidents, non-fatal shooting victims. Second page is homicide shootings, the numbers, and he points out specifically juvenile victims, juvenile suspects, juvenile victims, juvenile suspects from 2020 to 21 to the present. And you can see progress, I believe, not to be made in the work that GBI does. I'm not here today to talk about group violence intervention, but it's very important. But these are sort of eye-popping numbers that you have, and you will know 100% more than anybody you get in front of in the community about what's going on in terms of real numbers. And it won't be just generality. And my time will probably up.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
You didn't ring the bell.
Guys, go ahead, Jeff.
Jefferson, Mike mentioned GBI, Group Violence Intervention. So the way we in Restorative Justice feel like we are kind of a two-pronged approach with group violence intervention. Group violence intervention is where folks in the system are trying to target those kids who have really gotten deep into the quicksand of a criminal life. And by that, gang membership, retaliatory shootings, identifying those kids who are in that kind of deep trouble, the shooting stats. Restorative justice, one of the reasons Volunteers of America is such a beautiful partner with restorative justice is what we are doing. Stats show you can get a kid off that path earlier. In other words, sometimes we see people who go from 0 to 100 miles an hour and they're involved in a shooting, and we haven't seen them involved in the criminal justice system. But most of the time, you see heavy crimes leading up to that. So group violence intervention is, I think, an excellent initiative that I know Dream Withers, our criminal attorney, is very much behind. Looking at trying to identify these frequent flyers in the system, or how I like to say it, they've really gotten themselves deep in the person. It's when a kid comes out of a jail roll and they're saying, you know, they're now coming by and shooting at my granny's house and not just mine. So group violence intervention is at those most violent, strongest offenders. Restorative justice is for the whole host, not that we couldn't use it on those most serious of crimes, but what it's trying to do is be an early intervention. And I think that's why Volunteers of America is so interested in this work, because they're always on the back end trying to do addiction recovery and veteran services and other things. And as an organization and as a goal, they wanted to say, we want to be a part of helping get people better, but we want to be part of prevention too. And so going through and implementing this with our juveniles, and we started a young adult program too. So I'm glad Elizabeth Brown is here from the Commonwealth attorneys, because we know from science that especially young boys, their brains don't mature until about 25, 26. So there's a group that we've been missing somewhat in our program from 18 to 25, 26 that we're also trying to pinpoint. And I'm only mentioning that because it is really good work they're doing in GBI. And I think that there's kind of a place for both. There's a dual pronged approach that can come from using restorative justice with those younger folks, and then using GBI to target those that are very violent.
Yeah, thank you. You know, one of the things that impressed me about New Zealand was they talk about kids exercising their power, and they found out they had power to harm people, but they also learned the lesson that they had power to make things right, which was really eye-opening for so many of them. And having the situation caught early kind of avoided the vicious cycle of incarceration and reincarceration, and helped kind of more virtuous cycles of taking ownership for their life. And, you know, Alan McRae told stories of former offenders meeting the victims and talking in some strange way that offense was the best thing that ever happened to them, because it proved to them that they had the power to do things differently. They had the power to be a positive force in the community as opposed to just a negative force. We love Mike because of all the one-liners. You know, one was that we don't incarcerate people we're mad at, we just incarcerate people we're afraid of. And I just heard a new one that restorative justice doesn't turn the back on the victims. You know, restorative justice is a very victim-centered process. And no one knows restorative justice in this community and the details of it better than Libby Mill. Libby, I'd like to give you an opportunity both to talk about some of the statistics, the facts, how it's grown in our community and our state, you know, the plans of Volunteers of America. But then I also hope you'll share some stories, because these stories are so rich and so powerful. And, you know, if you juxtapose them to a youth who's in front of a judge who didn't commit the crime, with a victim who's in the back of the room with probably little, you know, challenging accountability, which really shows the power of this process.
Before I start talking about all that, I want to reiterate that the work we have done in Jefferson County and what we've been able to do across the state because of what we've shown, how it's been working in Jefferson County, it could not have happened without critical people that have supported us in the justice system, like Michael Hall. and Justice Bisig and other individuals, Justice Moore helped us get started in district court. Tom Long helped us get started in district court. And we're also, and I'll talk about it in a second, we're also working in Jefferson County Public Schools. We cannot do that with the superintendent and his staff, could not have done that without the superintendent. So we have gotten nothing but support in this community. And in fact, every time I talk about this somewhere, I have never received an answer, no, we cannot do that. Never. I know Tom has, but I haven't. But that was one individual. I've never had that. It's always, how would we do that? How could we do that? So that's always the conversation. And even when I go out into the state now and start talking about what we can do in implementing in new counties and different projects and different programs, it's like, never had any investment. Now, are they 100% on board? Probably not. But they always think about it. How can we do that? And one of the things we're able to do is restorative justice is not only a victim-centered response, which is really critical because we give victims a voice. They get to choose. They get the first choice in anything, the first saying, and they're involved in all the decisions that are made. We don't make a decision without consulting with the person who's involved, regardless of what that decision is. And then the other part of it is it has the anecdotal impact on the Mike talked about and Justice Bisig talked about in terms of the impact on the person who caused the harm. Positive outcomes for them. And when you think about what restorative justice is, and I'll tell you my why about why I'm so involved in restorative justice, is that accountability with restorative justice means that I'm willing to take responsibility for what I did. And I'm willing to meet with the person I harmed, to listen to and understand how my behavior impacted them. I'm willing to talk to them about that impact and what I need to do to make amends for the harm that. Now think about a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 24-year-old, and we had 72-year-old sitting in front of the people they harmed and having a conversation. Those conversations can't happen in the courtroom. But we're able to kind of those cases we started on because pull them out of the court process. I got involved with restorative justice because I was introduced to it when I worked for the Kentucky Department of Justice. And that was several years ago. I was able to go to a week-long training in Colorado, which was beautiful, wonderful people. While I was there, I was being trained by the people who established restorative justice practices in the United States, not just the fathers and the mothers of restorative justice in the United States. I was here, Mark Ogden, Kay Francis, Breakaway, who does all the research. They were our trainers. But when we came back from, and I was working in Frankfurt at that time, there was no appetite for restorative justice. So you just sat on it. And it came back around. And then the conversation started here in Jefferson County. So I was able to rekindle all that and work to get restorative justice implemented here. One of the reasons that I am so involved with restorative justice is because when I was working with the Department of Juvenile Justice, most of my time was working in residential programs for young people. The young men who were on their way to prison. And these young men would come in, of course, they come in with that street bravado, can't touch me, I'm a tough kid, you know, I can handle anything you throw at me. But after a while, you start seeing it. You start seeing what they've gone through. You start seeing what brought them to that point. You start seeing how they're going to struggle when they take those next steps. And some of those kids, we were preparing them to go to prison. How do you go to prison? Some of those kids, we were preparing them for their last interview or their last hearing with the judge, and hopefully they can get probation. So we were talking to these kids, and the people who needed to hear and understand what I knew working with these young men, never got to understand that these kids were remorseful, never got to understand that these kids were, what they were dealing with in their community and what their community could do to support them. So restorative justice allows that circle to come back together so that everybody can understand, everybody gets to hear. The person who's been harmed gets to talk about how it impacted them. The person who causes the harm gets to talk about what led to that, what are the contributing factors. You get to talk about it and ask all those questions. So it's a process that when you see it, you think, yeah, that's really simple, but it's so complex. And I can tell you at every conference I have facilitated, both parties will come in and we bring them together. We'll come in, it's us and them. And then there's a moment, and you can feel it, you can see it when it becomes us. And then the world work. That's the magic. That's when it happens, and you can see it. So, and I can tell you particular stories about kids when I was in the juvenile justice system that, you know, I know now that young men been with me since, and so, you know, all that work and what we could have done if we done things differently and what their outcomes could have been if we could have done things differently. But we're together and we need to deal with what we're doing today. I was in the office of the local DJJ office, Department of Juvenile Justice Office. They were the kids with shot at Jefferson. I was in that office and they were trying to find his family, to move his family, to go get his siblings out of school, so nobody would retaliate against his siblings, to go get his family, to go find the kid who's running around over the weekend, so he wouldn't get shot because he's next. And this kid had 9 months. Okay, so what can we do to make those differences? I'll tell you a story about the first case we got on let me back up a second. We're working in Jefferson County, and we've basically been able, with the help of Mike and a bunch of other individuals in the justice system, span the age range. We have a project working in Jefferson County Public Schools where we are in 7 elementary schools, getting ready to expand that to 14 elementary schools. We're working with kids who, if JSP is suspended, most of the elementary school kids will be suspended. So we're working to see, can we use restorative practices, circle processes, which is different than a conference process, just we're talking about. Can we put circle processes in place and help create success plans for these kids so that their issues in school do not lead them to encounters of injustice? Because we know those are critical paths. So we're working and we're going to start working in 14 schools this year. We have a diversion project in juvenile court where we get diversion of misdemeanor and low-level felony offenses out of the court designated worker program as well as juvenile court. We also have a project, a post-adjudicated project for kids that are no longer eligible for diversion, either because of the history court or because of serious of their charge, that those kids get referred to us if they're not eligible to be referred to Department of Juvenile Justice on probation or commitment. We have a diversion project out of district court. We want to concentrate on 18 to 26-year-olds because we know that that's the highest rate of recidivism for adults. And we don't turn anybody away. Like I said, our oldest person to refer to us is 17 years old. We also have a diversion project that's on hold right now in circuit court for young adults out of circuit court and to implement the same conference process that within the last year, we've been able to implement a project with the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice and to work with youth that have been probated to DJJ as well as youth returning from residential programs. So we start with kids that are potential to move toward the criminal justice system in elementary schools. to adults that are already in the justice system, as well as the young people who are on the back end of the juvenile justice system returning from Department of Juvenile Justice prison. And so we span the age range here, Jefferson County. We merged in January of 2020 with Volunteers of America, so we would have the bandwidth to expand, because prior to our merger, we were 3 staff. Now we're got about 18 staff, and we're in October, we will be in 18 counties. All 18 of those counties are working in the juvenile justice system. We have not expanded to the adult system yet in these counties, but we're going to start working on that. We're also starting a project with Department of Juvenile Justice to provide services that are an alternative to secure detention, because we know if a kid goes into secure detention, their odds of continuing in justice in the juvenile justice system go up 75%. So can we keep some of those kids out of secure detention to reduce their likelihood of escaping into the court system? And so, all right, our first referral from district court when we started that diversion project with the young man who had just turned 18. He was he was visiting cousins. He lived out of county. He was visiting cousins. He lived in Jefferson County. He was visiting cousins in South Stoll. And they decided to celebrate, and we all got very inebriated. And this young man was 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, decided he wanted Taco Bell. So luckily he didn't drive. There was a Taco Bell that was close to his neighborhood, and so he walked to the Taco Bell. Unfortunately, the Taco Bell was closed. And so it's 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, he's inebriated. He's in a neighborhood where all the houses and yards and garages and shrubbery and everything was the same. So he goes into the wrong yard, into the wrong garage. He's trying to figure out where he is. He doesn't realize, even though the garage was not locked, the alarm was off in the house of the homeowners. They were in retired trouble. Their property had been burglarized before, so they were very aware of what was going on. The gentleman who owned the property came out and found this kid in the garage and held him at gunpoint. While he's holding him at gunpoint, the young man sobers up some and starts trying to talk, make excuses about why he's in the garage. So he's taken to jail. His family comes and gets him the next morning and takes him home. But he's charged with murder. When this retired couple, goes to court, they tell the prosecutors, we want something different. We don't want the regular court process. So the prosecutors refer the young man to us. I facilitated this conference. I went to the home of the homeowners and met with them there to talk to them about what happened, and talk about what had occurred, and how it impacted them and what they wanted from the show. I met with the young man and his dad. Mother was not in the picture. She had left the family years before, and talked to him, and he understood that he was wrong, that you're 18, you're a little bit immature, you're anxious, you're afraid, how much can I say, how much should I say? So he did enough that I knew he could do what he needed to do in that with this family. And so he could take responsibility for what he did and explain why he did it. And so when we met, they came into the room, and the young man came in and presented himself extremely well, much better than I anticipated. And they always do that. They always perform and do much more than you anticipated them to do. And he came in and he talked about what he had done. He had been drinking, but that was no excuse. He should not have done that. He should not have wanted to police and told him stories about why he was on the property, and that he apologized for all the he called. While he's talking, the homeowner tears are running his. And he's sitting there, and he's barely, he's having a hard time breathing because he's trying not to cry. Just cry out, And he looked at this young man and he said, you do not know what you need to. You do not know what I've been through. I have not slept because I think about what would I have done if I shot? What would I have done if I killed you? I was crying, the man's crying, the dad's crying. Then they could have a conversation. A real conversation. So they had that conversation. And what they agreed to was that this young man would do a certain number of hours of community service. But he had to do it in his community. He had to do it with people that were the same age as his entire couple. And he had to do things to help. He had to go home and ask people in his neighborhood, can I help you? What can I do to help you? What can I do to make your life easier? And so then he ran out of people that he could go to in his neighborhood. He still had a few hours left and called us and he said, go to churches. So he had to go to churches. What can I do to help? What can I do to serve? What can I do? So he did his hours and I was able to call this couple and let them know. He did what you asked. And here's what he done. So they asked for something different and they got what they needed. So that's just one story of how this can work. The first case we got in 2011 was a young man who was 16 at the time. He was charged with theft. He had been charged with taking this older lady's purse. And I was to help facilitate this case too. I go to house convictions. We don't know any better. I met with this, she was a great-great-grandmother. She was 94 when we met her. She lived with her son, who was 72 or 70, and met with them. And so they told me what happened.
It was her person on the back of the chair.
Yeah, she would never tell the police or us how much money was in the purse. Because her son said it was about $800 to $1,000 in the purse because it's Christmas money. And if she had told that, his kid would have been charged. She didn't tell. So it was not. And so I met with her and she, you know, the story was she went up to go to the bathroom and then to get the car to come to the door for her, she left her person. And shut him up. He happened to work in the restaurant. Met with this young man and his mom, and it actually took us 2 meetings to help him get ready to meet with this with the victim and her son. And he finally started talking about what was going on in his life and what was going on. And his family was struggling because one side of the scene was very gang involved, a lot of violence. The other part of the family wasn't. And so he was getting pulled in both directions, which way he wanted to do. And his brother had gone away of that violence. And his brother, when it happened, he picked up the purse to go out to the restaurant. He did it to the great grandmother, and his brother came and took the purse from him. And the brother took it and took them. And so when we met with, and Tom was in part of this too in the end, so we met with the great grandmother and her son, and then this kid's mom and the kid. This kid is a 16-year-old linebacker style kid. He's sitting there, he's barely talking. He talks a lot, he's proud, he's not gonna cry. But he talked about what he had done, he was wrong, and he didn't stop his cousin, he didn't tell anybody what his cousin had done. He took the charge. So the grandmother sitting there, she keeps looking at me like, I don't want to ask anything of him. And like, she said it beside me. And I'm like, just listen, just all kind of stuff. And we're sitting there and the mom starts getting her hands in her purse and she starts pulling money out of her purse. And she steps up to walk out and she puts money in the grandmother's lap. And the grandmother said, she goes, I don't want this money. Just you get that. So the mom comes back and she went out to call the brother. You need to pay some of that. Your son did this.
And so we're sitting there trying to get through this conference, and the grandmother finally talks about, I don't want anything. What I want is for you not to, I want you to be good. I want you to be successful because I got grandkids. I don't want you to be. And I don't want you, your son saying, no, we can do something. And so we start talking about what the Christian did. And so they agree he's gonna stay in school. He's in an alternative school, he's gonna stay in school, he's gonna keep his job. And he kept his job. It turns out his grandmother managed a restaurant. He kept his job. And then we knew, because of what conversations we had before, that this young man lost his dad to violence, gun violence, when he was very small. So we asked him, what would your dad say if he were here? And he looked at us and he said, I think about that. I think about that. He said, so what would you think about having that? Yes. So this young man was going to continue in school and keep his job and he came so he called him to the and as we're going through the process, he's working through all the things he's expected to do. We have an issue that he's not going to meet a timeline to establish an agreement. So I asked him, I said, if the great grandmother is agreeable, would you willing to continue to make this agreement longer? And he said yes. And I went to the great grandmother and son. I said, if we run into a few roadblocks, he's willing to do it. If there are legitimate issues, it's not that he's not doing it, he's just running into some barriers. Are you willing for us to extend this timeline? And she said, yeah, but I want a meeting. And so he gets done, we schedule a meeting to bring everybody back together, and he's able to come in and talk about what he's done. And this time he's setting up, he's talking, he's very proud of himself. You know, there's nothing that he can share. And so he's talking about this. And as we're wrapping all this up, the great grandmother's son looks at him and he said, you know, this was not a crime. This was meant to be. And as they're leaving, they're exchanging phone numbers. And his great grandmother was, you know, she goes, you know, you have another grandmother, just call me. That's a person. You can see the impact of just having people together and talking about what led to this and how it impacted me, and everybody looking at each other as being individuals, being humans, not I'm a victim, I'm an offender. The other thing that we do all the time. Yes, I cried one time in the conference.
Libby, remind us of her name.
Her name was Marie.
Yeah, Marie was kind of our, you know, she did this before we had any experience or anyone really knew the first thing about it. And that story of her love was kind of that animation so much to work for so many of us. And there were so many brave and courageous community members who came up with really creative solutions that were both designed for accountability and to set the young man in a different path. The one story that I'll tell, and I think we're close to time, and then we can take one question, was the local businessman was, his property was vandalized by a young man in the community. And they had a conference, and you know, they decided that the young man was going to set aside money every month in order to repay for the damage that he had caused. But the businessman said that if you go to college, you can use that money for your college expenses. And I always cry when I tell them, because, you know, talk about kind of a dad slump for a young man that he never met, who he met because of this, you know, interaction that maybe in some ways were meant to be, as you can imagine. One, I tell people it's kind of the wisdom of the businessman, because he probably didn't want to alienate that young man because of others in the community. And it was a choice that would both make him feel good that he had done something better for the community, and that in some sense the victim had been repaired. Kristen, are we done at noon? And
If there's some questions that anybody would like to ask, we've got a few.
a question or two, and we'll stick around and be happy to talk more.
All right, cool, right now.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. From an economic lens, but I think answer and research has there been analysis of because there's really good at the education program, but it's good at the right to be lower, getting fully up to money.
We've done one in the last couple of years, we did one previously where what we do costs a third of what the equivalent stage in the juvenile justice system is. We haven't done it in terms of with the adult system, we probably need to do that, but we know that we're a third.
Well, right, we do, you're right. Early on, it's great to say it'll help make us feel whole. It's great to say it'll help youth in our system not want to reoffend, but oftentimes starting the program, the best selling point is to say it is economically better to do it this way than that way. So what Libby had us do early on, I remember because I was trying to fill out what it cost, was look at a judge's salary, look at the time spent on an individual case and what is that? Look at the prosecutor, the public defender's office time, look at the money it costs, $54,000 to incarcerate a juvenile and about $24,000 to incarcerate an adult. So what are these numbers that are cost to all of us as taxpayers? And then is restorative justice in addition to helping victims feel more whole and helping offenders not reoffend, is it more cost effective? And so we did very early on take a look at what was our cost to do a restorative justice conference and then have it be monitored versus the traditional crime and punishment paradigm, which again, I can't emphasize enough. This is not saying do away with that. There are people who are not guilty who need their long fought for due process rights in a court system. There are people who aren't prepared for whatever reason to take accountability, who need a traditional court system. But in so many of the cases, if you can get them to the table, and the reason that the numbers are so much better, I believe, in places like Rwanda, where they were able to go from a country with mass genocide to now being one of the most stable and peaceful countries in Africa, or New Zealand, is they legislated it in, where they do a restorative justice conference as a matter of course in their juvenile justice process. Whereas here, it's always been, we don't have legislation in place. It is a voluntary, we have to get the offender and the victim to volunteer to take part of this process. So we don't have it as part of our criminal justice system. But certainly the numbers we looked at, if we could not even have the success they do in New Zealand, because this legislated in where we do it in young adults and others in the criminal justice system, it's not going to work on every case. Like I said, we need our criminal justice system, but it's going to work in a lot of cases, and it certainly, as Libby said, costs a third less. And again, that's by comparing what it would cost in normal cases to go through the system, and then what it costs for us in the cases with the family group conference. So that's a really good question right here.
It's more about prevention too. I would imagine that there are indirect costs or other costs like health costs when it's for violent crime, injuries, and like that. Those, I didn't think the benefit is bigger than the support. And I don't know so.
No, that kind of research is out there, we haven't undertaken out here, that's very, very difficult.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.